So, today we're going to trace the story of an idea that promised to build a paradise on Earth, but ended up reshaping the 20th century in fire and steel. We're talking about socialism and its explosive eruption into the Russian Revolution.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? The 19th century was just buzzing with these huge, bold new ideas, all promising to fix what felt like a deeply unfair, broken world. But what actually happens when one of those ideas gets pushed to its absolute limit? What happens when an idea isn't just a theory anymore, but becomes a full-blown revolution?
Okay, so to really get this, we've got to rewind the clock. Picture Europe in the 19th century. It's a continent in total turmoil. The French Revolution had just proven that the old way of doing things, kings, aristocrats, the whole system, it could all be torn down. Suddenly, society itself seemed like it was up for debate.
And this debate basically broke down into three main camps. But what's so fascinating is how different these labels meant back then compared to today. So you had your conservatives, who were hitting the brakes, saying any change had to be slow and respect tradition. Then you had liberals, who wanted things like parliaments and individual rights, but, and this is a big but, only for men who owned property. And then you had the radicals. These guys were pushing for a government based on what the majority of people wanted, which was a genuinely shocking idea at the time.
And you know what was fueling all these intense debates? The absolutely brutal reality of the Industrial Revolution. For millions of people, life had become a nightmare of grueling hours in a factory for wages that were just miserable. Cities were exploding in size, which led to these overcrowded, filthy slums. This was the giant, messy problem that all those political ideas were desperately trying to solve.
And out of all this chaos came the most ambitious, the most far-reaching vision of them all: socialism. Now, this wasn't about just tweaking the system a little bit. Oh no, this was about tearing the whole thing down and completely redesigning it from the ground up.
The core idea of socialism was, in a way, pretty simple, but it was also completely radical. Socialists pointed their finger at one single villain they believed was the root of all society's problems: private property. Their argument was that as long as individuals owned the factories, the land, the resources, profit would always come before people. So, what's the solution? Society as a whole has to own and control everything. That way, they argued, the interests of the group would always come first.
And the guy who articulated this more powerfully than anyone was, of course, Karl Marx. He laid it all out in this really clear, logical progression. First, he said, look, the system we have now is capitalist, and it's built on owners profiting from the labor of workers. Simple as that. Second, the only way for workers to be free is to completely overthrow this system. Third, after the revolution, they have to build a new, radically socialist society where everything is controlled socially. And he believed that this would eventually, naturally, lead to the final stage, a truly communist society.
Now, these ideas were being debated in cafes and universities all across Europe. But they found their most fertile and, let's be honest, most explosive ground in one place in particular: Russia. Let's dig into why this one nation was such a unique pressure cooker, just waiting to detonate.
The biggest difference, really, was just the people themselves. While places like France and Germany were well on their way to becoming industrial nations, Russia was still overwhelmingly a nation of peasants. I mean, look at this. A staggering 85% of its people worked the land. That created a completely different kind of social tension than you'd find anywhere else in Europe.
And life for those people? It was unbelievably harsh. The Tsar, Nicholas II, ruled as an absolute monarch with total power. The peasants were desperate to get their hands on the land owned by the nobles. The few industrial workers that even existed faced conditions that were shocking, even for that time. And to top it all off, any kind of political party or opposition was just straight up illegal.
And then World War I came along and basically threw a giant can of gasoline on this already raging fire. By 1917, Russia had suffered over 7 million casualties. 7 million. The war completely shattered the economy, it led to massive food shortages, and it just destroyed any shred of faith people had left in the Tsar's government. That pressure cooker was about to blow.
Okay, so this is it. This is where everything builds to a massive climax. In the space of one single chaotic year, 1917, Russia gets torn apart, not by one, but by two different revolutions that would literally change the course of world history.
The crazy thing is, the first one, the one in February, it was basically an accident. It all started with women factory workers going on strike because there wasn't enough bread. But then the protests just grew and grew until the unthinkable happened.
Soldiers, who were ordered to fire on the crowds, just dropped their guns and joined them instead.
And you can really feel the spirit of that moment in the words of one of those striking workers, a woman named Marfa Vasileva. It wasn't about some complex political theory. It was this raw human cry for basic fairness, a simple refusal to accept being hungry while others had plenty.
I mean, what could the Tsar do? His army had turned against him. His capital city was in the hands of revolutionaries. He had no choice. On March 2nd, the monarchy that had ruled Russia for centuries just collapsed. A shaky, temporary government took its place, but this created a massive power vacuum right in the heart of Russia.
And that power vacuum, it didn't stay empty for long. In steps Vladimir Lenin and his highly disciplined Bolshevik party. Now, the October Revolution was the complete opposite of what happened in February. This wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, it was organized, and it was a ruthlessly efficient seizure of power. They didn't just wait for the people to rise up. They organized their own supporters and, in one swift move, took control of the entire state.
So, the Bolsheviks have won. They're in charge, which brings us right back to our big question from the beginning. What happens when the idea is actually put into practice? What does it really look like to build a communist state?
Well, they didn't waste any time. The changes were immediate and they were radical. They took over the banks and the factories basically overnight. They declared that all land was now social property and told the peasants to go and seize it from the nobles. And they made it crystal clear there would be no opposition. Russia became a one-party state with a brand new secret police, the Cheka, to hunt down and punish anyone who criticized them.
Well, as you can imagine, a program this radical wasn't going to go unchallenged. It plunged the entire country into a vicious, brutal civil war. You had the Bolshevik Reds fighting against a whole collection of opponents, the pro-Tsarist Whites, peasant armies called the Greens, and these groups were even backed by foreign powers who were absolutely terrified that socialism might spread.
After finally winning that war, the new Soviet government launched this massive project of state-controlled industrialization, called the 5-year plans. And on one level, you have to say, it was a staggering success. Production of things like oil, coal, and steel literally doubled in just a few years. But this incredible growth came at an immense human cost, with just horrific working and living conditions for the millions of people forced into the effort.
But if the cost in the factories was immense, what happened out in the countryside was a full-blown catastrophe. Stalin's policy of forcing peasants off their land and onto huge state-run collective farms was met with fierce resistance. The result was chaos, a devastating famine, and the deaths of over 4 million people. Now, this whole thing, it wasn't just contained inside Russia. The shockwaves from this revolution spread all over the globe, creating this incredibly complex legacy of both amazing hope and unimaginable terror.
For a lot of people around the world, especially in countries that were poor or colonized, the Soviet experiment looked like an absolute miracle. The famous Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore really captured this sense of awe. He saw a country of mostly illiterate peasants transform, almost overnight it seemed, into a powerful industrial state. It offered a brand new, powerful model for how to change the world.
But that was the image. The reality behind that miracle was incredibly grim. The Soviet Union denied its own people the most basic freedoms. It enforced total censorship, and it ruled through brutal repression. The dream of a socialist paradise was, in reality, built by the forced labor of millions. By 1939, more than 2 million people were locked away in prisons and labor camps.
And this, really, is the huge paradox we're left with. A revolution that promised to liberate the worker ended up creating one of the most repressive states in all of human history. And understanding that contradiction, that gap between the incredible promise and the brutal reality, is the key to understanding the conflicts, the politics, and the ideas that defined the entire 20th century and, frankly, continue to shape our world today.